Welcome back to the show. Today I want to share some thoughts on the 4 P's, or the 4 pillars. It's kind of like why I'm in this situation right now, surrounded by these ancient pillars. Now, I've frankly never been a math whiz, but from time to time I come up with an equation that has impacted my life and I hope will impact your life too. So I call it P times 4. Again, the letter P times 4. So the first P is problems, the second P is pruning, the third P is people, and the fourth P is pressure. Again, problems, pruning, people, and pressure. So I want to run through several examples of all or most of these P's here on the show that can maybe give you an idea or two that can help you get through some really difficult times in your own life. So what's the first P? The first P is performance. So in order to reach any high level of performance, whatever you want to call it, whether it's education or work or sports or whatever it looks like, you have to have a long road of performance, consistent performance. So each of these P's are essential for you if you really want to reach any level of any status in your life at all. Bill Gates, Microsoft Bill Gates, his first business failed. Yes, the richest person in the world couldn't make any money at first. In fact, a story says Gates' first company, Trafodata, a device that could read traffic tapes and process the data, failed miserably. When Gates and his partner, Paul Allen, tried to sell it, the product wouldn't even work. Gates and Allen didn't let that stop them from trying again, though. Here's how Allen explained how the failure helped them. Even though Trafodata wasn't a roaring success, it was seminal in preparing us to make Microsoft's first product a couple years later. Now, there's biblical examples, people in the Bible that have had problems that they had to go through. There was a guy named Paul in the New Testament who had substantial problems that he was struggling with his entire lifetime. There was a guy that got into a wrestling match named Jacob, and he had a limp that lasted for the rest of his life. There was a guy named Moses. You may have heard the name, Moses. He had a speech impediment. Some say he stuttered, and he was challenged to go talk to a king of Egypt and demand certain things. And he was like, dude, I can't do this because I can't even talk right. That's Moses. David, the guy in the Old Testament, David, if you don't know the Bible, David was a shepherd originally, and he eventually became a king and wrote a bunch of stuff and some songs. He was a musician, very emotional guy. He took what didn't belong to him, and to be quite frank with you, he had a guy murdered so that he could take this guy's wife to be his own wife. So it was a pretty dramatic storyline there. There was a guy named Solomon, which is David's son, who had hundreds and hundreds of wives. Can you imagine back then? We're talking 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. He had hundreds of wives. That's some problems. Okay, I can handle one, but more than one, he had hundreds. A guy named Ahab in the Old Testament, Ahab, he had a wife named Jezebel. Jezebel wanted what wasn't hers. She saw let me use modern terms, she saw an income-producing business that she wanted so badly that she harassed her husband Ahab to the point that Ahab had this business owner killed so that he could satisfy Jezebel. That's some problems, isn't it? Jeremiah was a prophet in the Old Testament. He was a younger man in the beginning, obviously, and he was challenged that his youth was going to get in his way from doing what he thought that he should be doing for the people in his area. There's a guy named Peter. You may have heard St. Peter, some people call him. Peter was not always a saint, I'll tell you that for sure. Peter was a guy that was impulsive. He inserted foot in mouth quite often. He thought he had all the answers. He thought that, frankly, his way was best, and he had no problem in telling Jesus where to get off. So he had his own internal problems, but yet some people these days call him a saint. So that kind of elaborates, it kind of expounds for me that a lot of the most famous people have had problems. So there was a guy in the Old Testament, in Genesis chapter 26, about a guy named Isaac. And Isaac, when he was an older man, moved to this particular place. This is after his father Abraham passed away. And they experienced a famine at that time. It didn't rain a whole lot. The crops dried up. So when he experienced this famine, there was a time and a place where they would need to dig new wells. And the raiding armies of the time would come by and fill up these wells. And it got really, really old. So there came a time where he did not want to make any waves. So in Genesis chapter 26, it says this: "Now there was a famine in the land besides the previous one that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to this particular place called Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines." Now, just for concept here and for a broader picture, the Israelites and the Philistines were not best of friends. In fact, they were not close at all. They were enemies. So in verse 2 of Genesis 26, it says, "The Lord appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I'll tell you, and go from here to there.'" And in other words, Isaac was challenged to look at things from a different point of view. In fact, the story says that God told Isaac that his descendants were going to be many. This famine was not going to destroy him at all. So in verse 6, it says that Isaac lived in this little place called Gerar. And so when the men of the place asked about his wife, she said it was his sister. And he was challenged because his father Abraham did the same thing. In other words, the bigger picture here is when problems occur, you tend to want to back up. You tend to want to run from the confrontation. I'm not a real great fan of confrontations. But if you corner me and give me no other option, I'm going to come out swinging. And Isaac was in a situation where it was either he was going to lie about who his wife was because the king wanted his wife. And in those days, the kings could take the wives from any human being on the planet. That's just how it was back then. So Isaac lied about it. He was intimidated by the problems. So later on in the story, I'm not getting into the long story, but later, Isaac sowed in this land. He planted crops, and those crops produced a great harvest for him because he learned his lesson over a period of time. Again, this is a very, very long story. But then later on, his people dug more wells, and people would continue to fill up the wells to try to starve this guy and his family out. So problems are going to come in ways that maybe you and I have never even imagined. But Isaac's tenacity, he said, was he did it for the sake of his father Abraham. Sometimes you and I need a why that's bigger than what we're going through. Think about that concept for just a second. Some of us, I believe, need a why that's bigger than what we're going through. Because oftentimes what you're going through can literally stop you in your tracks. These days in my life, I have to give myself many whys, W-H-Y. I have to give myself many whys daily in order to overcome some of the whats, some of the stuff that I go through every day. And some of the stuff that I go through every day is, for me, difficult. Other people, it might not faze them, but for me, it's an uphill climb. It really is. So Isaac, one of his whys was that he's going to be tenacious with staying where he is, with making sure that his family and the people that work with him prosper for the benefit and for the sake of his father that really set the scene, which really got the process going. He didn't want to disgrace what his father had done. So the second P is problems. Sometimes problems have a way of creating steel in your spine, or some people say jello in your soul. Problems is the second piece. Sylvester Stallone, he was still an iconic actor and one of the most successful actors in the country. He wrote and shared and starred in 3 Oscar-winning performances, nominated by lots more. And Rocky, which became a franchise, as most of us know, he starred as John Rambo, and a whole lot of other stuff was going for him. But complications that his mother suffered during labor forced her doctor at the time to use forceps during his birth, and that that resulted in some severe nerve damage and paralysis in parts of Stallone's face. So as a result, the lower left side of his face is paralyzed, including parts of his lip and tongue and other parts and his chin, an accident which kind of gave him his snarling look and slightly slurred speech as a result of an accident that happened when he was born. Frederick Douglass, leader of the abolitionist movement, gained note for his dazzling oratory and speaking about anti-slavery. He stood as a living counterexample to slaveholders' arguments, and they said that he didn't have the intellectual capacity to function as independent Americans. Many Northerners also found that it was hard to believe that such a great orator had been a slave. He was born into slavery, and violence and separation from his parents taught himself to read. Think about that a minute. He was born into slavery, but didn't use slavery as an excuse, which is a substantial problem if you've never been a slave, to keep him from realizing some extraordinary achievements in his life. The second P is problems. Bethany Hamilton's story. Raised by surfers in Hawaii, Bethany Hamilton was born to be in the water. A natural surfer, she began competing professionally as a young child. However, at age 13, she lost her arm and nearly lost her life in a vicious shark attack. 1 month later, she was back on her surfboard with a determined spirit and positive attitude. 2 years later, she won first place in the Explorer Women's Division of the NSSA National Championships, even though she was missing a limb. Think about that. Would you be so tenacious if you missed a limb as a result of a shark attack? The third P in this example is pruning. Pruning. In the Bible, there's a storyline in St. John chapter 15. Let me kind of share a piece of it with you. The story says, I am the true vine. My Father, speaking of God in this story, is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so it also may bear more fruit. Again, the story goes on and on and on. But pruning can be productive. My wife likes to plant herbs, and she likes to plant flowers and bushes at our house. And it's interesting that almost every year she gets out there at some time during the year. I don't pay attention to what time of the year, but she prunes back some of the bushes because sometimes the bushes grow out of control. So she prunes them down, and it's amazing how, as a novice in gardening and horticulture, that I would think that pruning would kill the bush or kill the plant. But in fact, it does not. Because the following year, it comes out even bigger and even more beautiful as a result of the pruning. So pruning can be productive. Think about that for just a minute. Pruning can be productive. Think about the teachers that you've had in your life that have been, how should I put it, direct with you. They've been kind of sort of in your face. They've told you some things and shared some things with you that were a little hard for you to swallow. But as a result of you swallowing or following their advice, you look back now 5, 10, 20, 40 years later and realize that if that teacher hadn't loved you enough to prune you a little bit, you would not be where you are today. Now, let me kind of expand that just a little bit more. To place yourself in relationships and situations that enables you to be pruned by people that are smarter than you is a sign of maturity. Think about that a minute. To place yourself in situations and in relationships that you allow yourself to be pruned by other people, that is a sign of maturity. Because if you and I want to get better, we're not going to get better by ourselves. We're not going to evolve by ourselves. We're not going to get smarter by ourselves. Yeah, maybe you're smarter than me. I grant that. But you're not going to get to the mountaintop without help. You're not going to get to the mountaintop without mentors that have been to the mountaintop more than a few times. So when you place yourself in their circle, whether it's the books they write, whether it's the material that they put out, whether it's teaching material that they put out there for you, you are literally placing yourselves in their hands, potentially remotely, that enable them to prune some things off of you that don't need to be pruned. I know most kids do not like to be pruned. I have 6 kids, and most of my 6 kids do not like to be pruned. But if they understood that the pruning that I'm trying to do with them is actually for them, that can help them blossom later on in life. I resented the pruning when I was a kid, no doubt about it, every single time. I was like, you're an old person, you're my parent, they don't know what they're talking about. When I was younger, my employers were stupid, or so I thought, when in reality, I looked in the mirror, I was the stupid one. I know I'm probably not alone in that situation for sure. So pruning is very important. In fact, the actual ancient Greek text of the word pruning talks about cleansing or to clean up. So when you and I allow ourselves to be pruned, we're actually being cleaned up or cleansed, but it doesn't happen by itself. To grow and to be able to grow, you have to be willing to be cleaned up from time to time. When my daughter Juliana, she got cancer for the third time, we were told that it was really bad. There was disease in her chest and her pelvic area, and we were told back then in 2012 that she was not going to survive. So I asked her, I said, if there were 3, she didn't know this, by the way, at the time. So I asked her, if there were 3 wishes that you'd like to have, what would it be? She said, she thought about it a second, she said, not to have cancer. I said, well, working on that. She said, $1 billion, that's with a B. Oh, I swallowed hard on that one. I said, I'm working on that one. A few seconds passed, she said, a puppy. Now, with 6 kids and having a dog, that's probably not something that I wanted to do. But in her situation, my wife and I talked about it, and right away, we felt it was right to get a dog. So to make a very long story short, we ended up going to the SPCA up in York, Pennsylvania, and through some online contacts, we found a little Shih Tzu that, according to the SPCA, said that when they found this dog, which was a stray, she was all matted up, all in hair all dried up and caked on, and you couldn't hardly even tell it was a dog, I was told. So we go up and pick up the dog, and they had certainly cleaned her up and shaved off all the extra hair and all that stuff. And underneath all that dirt and all that matting was a little puppy that Juliana eventually named Maddie, M-A-D-D-I-E, Maddie. Maddie's become part of our family. But in order for Maddie to be part of anybody's family, she had to be pruned. She had to be cleansed. She had to be cleaned up because she was a stray. She was matted. And I wonder how many people you know that you look around you every day and you look at them and they're disgusting. They're matted. They're dirty. They're unkept. They even probably smell a little bit. And you look at them and think, there is no way anybody could want them. And then one day, at some point down the road with some of them, you see them walking down the street, or you see them walking to where you are at a restaurant or a church or a workplace, and they're all cleaned up. You hardly even recognize these people because somebody else in their past saw what was underneath all that matted fur, all the dirt. And the one that was matted, allowed somebody to prune them. They allowed somebody to clean them up. And underneath all that stuff is a beautiful human being. I wonder if you and I place ourselves in the hands of people that will help clean us up, that will prune us, that will enable us to become beautiful through time. Which leads me to the fourth P. The third P is people. The third P is people. Let me share a story. It's hard to imagine how anyone could tease the charming 7 foot 1 inch Shaquille O'Neal, but that's exactly what happened when Shaq was growing up with a stutter. Kids called him Sasquatch. What else to call a large, gangly kid who had the name Shaquille, a name no one had heard before. And Shaq was terrified of his stutter. He would sit in class knowing that if a teacher called on him, he never would be able to get the words out. I'd rather take the 0, he joked. I still stutter to this day, but now I'm more cool with it now, he says. Watching him grin as he explains what he does to disarm listeners when he knows he's about to stutter is almost as great as watching any basketball or any basket he ever scored. So listen to this. People in your own life, depending on who you choose to surround yourself with, can either make you or break you. Shaquille O'Neal and so many other athletes chose to surround themselves with coaches that believed in them, that forced them to do things that were painful, that were uncomfortable, that were out of their box for a period of time. In fact, there's an old proverb in the Old Testament that says, he who walks with wise people, my paraphrase, he who walks with wise people will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. The companion of fools will suffer harm. I know a lot of people that by the dictionary definition of fool are fools because they think they have all the answers. Think about this a second. The wisest people on the planet know that they don't know at all. In fact, they're always learning. They're always evolving. If you look at the richest people on the planet, they have the largest libraries in their homes. Think about that a second. The most wealthy people on the planet have the largest libraries in their home. Now, the opposite of that is true. The poorest people on the planet don't have any books in their home at all. Think about that a second. The poorest people on the planet do not have any books in their home at all. So there has to be a correlation, doesn't it, between wealth and wisdom and opportunity and learning from people that are smarter than you and I. That's one of the reasons why I have a lot of books, because I understand that I have to rely on other people's knowledge. It's called OPK. I have to rely on other people's knowledge. So what do you need to know? One person said this. Who do you need to know that knows what you need to know? Again, who do you need to know that knows what you need to know? Who do you need to know that knows what you need to know? So if you're not learning from people, if you're not mastering these 4 Ps, then guess what's going to happen? You're not going to maximize the life that you have lived. You can even leverage other people's energy. I'll be very candid with you. Sometimes, in some circumstances, I need to be around people that are hyper. Why? Because sometimes their hyperness motivates me to take the next step forward versus me placing myself in relationships or situations where people are laid back. Laid back people don't push me forward, and some days I need to be pushed forward. Most days I don't want to go to the gym. I don't these days. I've been going to the gym now 4 or 5 days a week for, I don't know, 9, 10 years now. The older I get, the more days I don't want to go. But what forces me to go? Other people. Because I mentally am putting myself as accountable to other people. You can also lean on other people's failures and other people's ideas. You don't have to be the originator of the idea at all. You don't. In fact, most ideas are not original. They stand on the shoulders of other people. They sit on the shoulders of people who've started something great and they built upon it. There's nothing wrong with that. So I'm hoping that this show today gave you a few ideas on the 4 Ps that can really help you maximize some concepts and some ideas in your own life that if you leverage some of this stuff, it can change your life in a dramatic way. My name's John Carver, and I thank you for watching.